Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the first workshop of the Nature Smart Cities UK Capacity Building Programme. My name is Anna Oxenham and I work in the climate change team at Southend-on-Sea City Council. I'm also the project lead for the EU Interreg 2Cs Nature Smart Cities project. This project, which brings together 11 partners from 4 countries, started in September 2019 and will run through until March 2023. I would like to use a short animation video to introduce the Nature Smart Cities project to you.
Around 3/4 of Europeans live in cities. Many of these cities are dealing with the effects of climate change, such as heat stress, air pollution, paved surfaces, roads and buildings further increases these effects. We can do something about this. Trees, rain gardens, green roofs and walls, and other vegetation help to cool cities on hot summer days, capture heavy rainfall, and improve air quality. Research shows that green infrastructure provides a range of other benefits, such as increased biodiversity and improved human health. However, cities often find green infrastructure expensive or difficult to implement. The Nature Smart Cities project aims to support cities to address these challenges. 8 city partners and 3 academic partners in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands and France have joined forces. Together, we will develop a business model to promote green infrastructure solutions, bridging the gap between research and practice. The model is based on evidence that we collect through interviews with local authorities and analysis of geographical, biophysical and economic data. We also review existing valuation tools and finance options. The model is tested, validated and refined through 7 green infrastructure pilots: Southend-on-Sea, Cambridge, The Hague, Capella, Antwerp, Bruges and Lille. A step-by-step methodology will support cities to use this business model to implement green infrastructure and build climate resilience. For more information, visit our website, naturesmartcities.eu.
As you saw in the video, the main output of the Nature Smart Cities project is a business model to support local authorities to make compelling business cases for investment in green infrastructure projects, to build climate resilience and provide a range of benefits to urban areas. The business model and accompanying step-by-step methodology will be made available for you at the second capacity building workshop. These 2 free workshops, of which this is the first, will be rolled out across the 4 project countries as part of the capacity building programme to support local authorities across the 2Cs region in implementing green infrastructure projects. And I thank you once again for joining us today for the first UK workshop for an insight into what the business model tool can offer. More details about the second workshop in London in June will be shared at the end of this morning and in follow-up emails. I will now hand over to Pippa Halings from Talking Transformation, who will be our facilitator today. Over to you, Pippa.
Morning, everyone. And what we'd like you to do, and it's in the chat, Zoom chat function there on your screen, is to do a little icebreaker. And we'd really like to do a little quick survey with you of a few questions. So either on your phone, or if you open up another tab on your computer, if you go to www.menti.com and you enter in the code 21 22 25, then you will be able to answer very, very rapidly this series of multi-choice and ranking questions. And we're going to compare your answers with a bit of research that was done with many local authorities across the country. So that's 21 22 25 is the code to put into www.menti.com. I know many of you will have used this interactive polling and ranking app, but it may be new to some of you. If you can join, that would be fantastic. And we can start to see your answers coming through. And let's have a look at the answers now. I've got 27 people have managed to go in and start answering the questions. I see we've got nearly 50 people who've joined the Zoom webinar today for Nature Smart Cities' first capacity building workshop. And during the lockdown, in what ways was nature important to you? And as you can see in the middle, as with any wordscape, it's those words that are bigger and brighter, are the words that most people are combining their answers on, that they're all coinciding. Exercise, escape, and freedom, you know, especially in these very, very dark days, 2 years of lockdown, and now the news that we have at the moment, how much we value that exercise, escape, freedom, that fresh air, which is calming, soothing. We've seen comfort, so important in these days. We've got socializing. Big word is connection, connecting, please. That mental health, observation, change of scenery, healing, that healing process that's there, that it brings you stability, headspace. Wonderful words that you're using. Beauty, yes, beauty. Desk breaks, absolutely, where we're all in our Zoom meetings, very much. Keeping me sane, yeah, absolutely. And again, those in the middle, exercise, escape, fresh air, freedom, joy, absolutely. So then we say, what comes to mind when you think of green infrastructure? Very kind of, instead of the grey infrastructure that we know about, green infrastructure. And here, you know, we've got trees, parks, nature, biodiversity. It's wonderful. We've got 43 out of the 50 people who have joined are actually in Mentimeter and answering these questions now, which is fantastic. Open space, green walls, again, that connectivity, green roofs, health. We've got climate in there as well, and sustainability, urban greening, emptying my thoughts, improved health. But in the middle, those big words are trees, nature, biodiversity, open space, parks. So then we've asked you quickly to rank in order of importance how these benefits are currently rated by those who make decisions, not necessarily you, but it could be you, those who make decisions about green infrastructure in your city or local authority. So we've got 21 people who've moved on to this question. If we can look at that at the moment, and this is averaging out our responses, we have opportunities for recreation, enhancing biodiversity, supporting active travel, and attractiveness of the area are being ranked in the top 4. As you see, somebody else has gone, and so the ranking is changing. As you join in, the ranking is changing. So we've got 24 people who filled in this question, this ranking exercise. Yep, so now we're still with 29, nearly 30 people who are on this one. We've got enhancing biodiversity, attractiveness of the area, opportunities for recreation. Those are the ones that we've got in the top. And we'll go on to the next one. We can come back to this one. To what extent are these barriers, the things below, are these barriers to you being able to develop green infrastructure projects in your local authority? And these are about issues about, can you do that compelling business case and prove value when you're comparing this to a grey infrastructure project, a traditional project, a non-green infrastructure project? Or is it about low prioritization of green projects within your local authority? Or even public skepticism, if you're looking value for money with public taxpayer money perhaps, and convincing developers to take that approach too, others to take the green infrastructure approach. Wonderful, thank you. So if we look just back again here now, as we're going to go into a very interesting presentation on research that was done through a number of local authorities to see how this compares in terms of the ranking in order of importance of how these are currently rated by those who make decisions. We have enhancing biodiversity, opportunities for recreation, and attractiveness of the area. And what extent are these barriers that proving value, which I'm sure is why you're joining this webinar today in the first 2 sessions this morning, which are all about the business model, which can help to provide that compelling business case for you. And Phil, I hope that you've been able to take those and have a look at those to compare those for you. And then what you can do now is within your Mentimeter, as we go on to now a series of presentations that we have and keynote speakers, you can keep open your Mentimeter and you can enter any questions that you have for the speakers coming up. So thank you very much, everyone, for that. I hope you can now see the agenda. You can give me a nod there, Anna, if you can see the agenda on your screen. So you will all have received the agenda and you'll also have known this morning to get a reminder email that we're running 2 sessions. The first session this morning is with a keynote speech by Polly Billington, CEO of UK 100. Polly's running a little bit late. She's going to be joining us at 9:30. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask Phil Black to give his presentation first of all, which compares and introduces you to a piece of research done about local authority perspectives. Then we'll hear from Polly Billington, and then we're going to give you a run through of what the business case, business model can actually do before we then have a coffee break. And whilst you're sipping your coffee, you have the chance to watch some wonderful videos, including the introductory video. And then you'll join with the second link that you received by email this morning to get into groups and test drive the business model to see how it works and how you can help create a design that can create a compelling business case. So please use the chat function, put in your name, the local authority organization you belong to so that everyone can see who's here. We've got 54 people here. Where are you all from? Which local authorities? Whereabouts in the country or other countries are you from? Because this is a partnership project from the different countries. And please continue to use Mentimeter, as I said, to ask your questions. If you're not in there, you can put it into the chat as well. And the interactive group work session will begin at 11 o'clock with the new link. And I'm going to introduce now, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Phil Back, who is a research consultant to Nature Smart Cities. And Phil, you're going to tell us a little bit more about the research that you've been doing about enablers and barriers to green infrastructure in smaller municipalities. I'm going to stop sharing and you're going to upload your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Pippa, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here doing this after so many years of work on Nature Smart Cities and the business model. I'm just going to give you this morning a brief summary of some key results from 2 pieces of research that we've done as part of this project. One was to give us a clearer understanding of users' needs and wishes from the work that we've been funded to do. And the other was to test whether the project actually delivers against those needs and wants. Both pieces of research have been written up. And both reports are on the Nature Smart Cities website, which I'll give you details at the end of this presentation. But what you're getting this morning is headlines only from much bigger pieces of work. And I think that a lot of the material in those reports would be of wide interest to local authorities that are working on green infrastructure. And I commend them to you. But I would say that because I wrote them. So there we are. So the first study that I'm talking about is a study that I did with Imperial College. We carried out 53 interviews in smaller cities with less than 500,000 population. They were quite lengthy interviews, and they were with decision makers and officers working in green infrastructure, with green infrastructure responsibilities. In all, we interviewed people from 15 different local authorities in the UK, Belgium, Netherlands, and France. And the interviews covered a range of areas. We asked people about their understanding of green infrastructure, their perception of their authorities' priorities, their perception again of the obstacles that get in the way of delivering green infrastructure, the type of evidence that they need to support a proposal for green infrastructure, and quite a lot more besides. So we got a lot of data out of that interview. And what we found was, in relation to decision makers, and this is officers and elected members, but this is their perception of the decision makers in their councils, was quite a variety of levels of understanding. In some authorities, they suggested that their decision makers had a very good understanding, a strong understanding of green infrastructure. In others, it was recognized that that level of understanding was quite limited. And we also found that there were different understandings of what green infrastructure actually means. So that's interesting, because people are not necessarily talking about the same thing when they're talking to each other. But generally, it was fair to say that decision makers were seen as less well informed than officers. There's nothing unusual about that. Officers are there to have the detailed knowledge and understanding. But I think it would also be fair to say that decision makers were seen as having to be supported, as having to be helped or encouraged to understand green infrastructure and green infrastructure propositions. And engagement with green infrastructure was affected by these three sets of challenges. In some authorities, there were political challenges, trade-offs that had to be made within coalitions running on authority, opposition in some authorities from climate change deniers. Decision-making politicians are not necessarily in full control over the policy. For instance, we found one authority where green success on the part of one elected member is very popular with her public, but is less well appreciated by her leadership, which is from a different political party. So there's a bit of a political issue there. The practical challenges, well, the realities of governing mean compromise. The scale of smaller cities means that generally there's perhaps a single person, maybe even just a part-time person, responsible for green infrastructure or for green policy generally. And there is limited capacity in smaller authorities to influence either policy or projects. And there are operational challenges. Green infrastructure is multifunctional. It crosses interdisciplinary boundaries. And there's a split of responsibilities in some authorities between aldermen, between portfolio holders, or between departments. And that can make an integrated approach more difficult to achieve, especially if different departments have their own priorities to deliver. So what are decision makers looking for in a green infrastructure project? Well, you thought they were looking for biodiversity, recreation, attractiveness, and these other things. Here's what our survey showed, admittedly a couple of years ago, but biodiversity isn't anywhere near the top of this list. What does come out on top is an attractive place to live. Now, the red line here is a score of 1, and the range of scores is between 0 and 2. So anything above the red line can be seen as a reasonably high priority. And anything below the red line is not necessarily a priority at all in these authorities. And you can see that the top rated priority is an attractive place to live, which is not normally the reason why you do a green infrastructure project. You would normally have something much more tightly defined as the rationale behind a green infrastructure project, but it shows that this kind of spin-off benefit of making the place look nicer is actually very, very important to the people making decisions. Health comes in as the second highest priority here. This survey was done before COVID, so health might well take a different position now. But even before COVID, it was seen as a high priority, a gain from green infrastructure. And active travel, which you rated highly as well, comes in third place. Recreation, which you also put high on your list, comes in above the red line as well. Much less important in terms of priorities in these cities are things like reducing noise pollution. Carbon capture is quite a surprising low scorer here, given that many of these authorities have net zero policies in place, but that doesn't seem to be translating into green infrastructure projects as yet. Increased land values, well, in some authorities, there's a process of gentrification going on and increased land values are seen as a benefit. But in others, the land values have already increased beyond the reach of many people, and land values is seen as a negative impact. So let's have a look at some of those priorities. An attractive place to live, of course, it's a strange result, but it might deliver social benefits alongside it in terms of attracting or retaining residents. It might deliver economic benefits in terms of tourism or attracting new business to invest in the area. And it might deliver environmental benefits such as flood alleviation or biodiversity. Now, those benefits might feel more important to the people proposing the project, but they may be secondary benefits as far as deciders are concerned, where the key ingredient is attractiveness. And so in putting a project forward, it's important to get the emphasis right and to press the right buttons for your decision maker. We noticed that health was highly rated, and so is active travel, which is a contributor to health. But other contributors like pollution or noise aren't rated highly. So there are questions about whether there's a good recognition of health issues, and particularly perhaps mental health issues. Resilience was usually focused on flood risk reduction rather than drought or heat. Only in those cities that have experienced extreme heat up to this point was resilience linked to that at all. Otherwise, it was about flood results. There are some big variations in these results at city level, so it's important to know what local priorities are and to link green infrastructure proposals to those priorities specifically. But the overall high average scores for things like attractiveness and the overall low average scores for things like carbon capture suggest a widespread consistency between cities, both on what is a high priority and what is a lower priority. And what we also notice is that the higher priorities tend to be those that are visible, that can be touched, and that can be delivered quickly. These were characteristic of the priorities and projects that were being delivered in these cities. Here's what you said were the barriers to green infrastructure. The difficulty proving the value of the project, something we hope our business model will confront. The low prioritization of green projects. Public skepticism over value, not really a barrier, much lower score there, but convincing developers to take a greener approach comes out as the highest scorer on this somewhat ad hoc survey. And here's what our 53 respondents said were the biggest issues in relation to obstacles. Again, the red line indicates the midpoint of a scale between 0 and 2. Anything above the red line can be seen as something tending towards a serious obstacle. Around the red line, it's an obstacle that can be overcome. And well below the red line, it's not an obstacle at all. So it's interesting that the highest, the biggest obstacle, which you might expect to be funding, isn't actually funding at all. It's conflicting priorities within the local authority. Funding comes in second, and then come the two that you rated very highly: convincing developers and proving the value of green infrastructure. The ongoing revenue costs are a concern for some authorities. They see maintenance costs being potentially higher for green infrastructure than they are for greyer alternatives. Down at the bottom end, the least difficult obstacle of the ones that we presented to people is partnership with outside organizations. It's interesting that partnership with outside organizations is less of an obstacle than partnership within the council itself, partnership between departments. That seems to be a little more difficult. So some interesting results there. But political support for green infrastructure is seen to be an obstacle that can be overcome, and awareness of green infrastructure, similarly, an obstacle, but one that can be overcome. Now, the interesting result here is the one right in the middle of council capacity, which it comes out as just around the 1 mark, but actually that conceals a huge range of results, of which 1 is the average. In some authorities, council capacity is a huge obstacle to green infrastructure. In others, it's not really an obstacle at all. So some thoughts about this. Well, the conflicts over priorities focus particularly on housing projects and on highways projects. It suggests that there's quite a rigid separation of responsibilities between departments. It's difficult in smaller authorities for the green agenda to force its way into bigger housing projects or into bigger highways projects. But it also suggests there's an absence of an effective overarching strategy or a corporate approach that requires green integration into these important policy areas. We came across planning regimes that were intended to be the first line of defense, scoring the projects coming forward for planning consideration against green criteria, but often that wasn't effective. The overriding priority was to get the housing built, and if it didn't meet the green agenda, that could be ignored or overlooked. Proving the value needs to be more accessible. It's difficult. And in smaller authorities, officers are not necessarily equipped to make a convincing case for a green alternative to a traditional approach. Capacity issues I mentioned. There are issues of available time, there are issues of resource, and there are issues related to the skills of officers in smaller authorities. They don't necessarily have access to the kind of things that can help develop a green infrastructure business case. We came across smaller authorities, for instance, that have no access to a GIS system, for instance, which would be quite a useful addition to their toolkits. And this issue of partnership with other departments being more problematic than partnership with external bodies. Well, of course, you can choose the external bodies you partner with. You can't choose whether or not to partner with other departments. So I think that can be explained, but it's nevertheless an interesting challenge to put to yourselves as to whether it's easier to partner with the Environment Agency than it is to partner with your Highways Department. We asked people about what sort of evidence they would need to be convinced about a green infrastructure project. We gave them several different types, which I've grouped together here, according to their subject. And although environmental evidence comes out as the most prominent, all three are pretty strong. There's not really anything much to focus on here. But when we look at this in terms of the beneficiary that is resulting from the project, it's very clear that there's a huge difference. The direct column is the people, is the idea that people will benefit directly from the installation. So for instance, a recreation project is obviously going to be focused on the people who will benefit. A flood attenuation project will need to focus on the people that will benefit. An indirect project means that over time there'll be some sort of environmental gain, such as urban cooling or resilience. And a general benefit means it's not specifically aimed at humans, so it might be about habitat retention and so on. So on the type of evidence, the direct benefit is much more important. And it goes back to the earlier slide. It's more visible, it's more immediate, it's more easily understood by the decision maker, it's more recognizable by the public, and a little bit cynically, it's more likely to offer publicity opportunities. Well, we found that there was an increasing need for reliable data to forecast ecosystem performance and gains. At the moment, a lot of business cases are based on bland, unquantified assurances. We'll get more of this. This problem will be reduced, but no metrics and no proof. There's limited access to data and limited access to specialist skills in data interpretation. And that means a greater reliance on anecdotal data or on general assurances when metrics might actually be more powerful. So a tool that can help with all of this would need to demonstrate qualities of usability, no steep learning curve, easily sourced input data, and limited specialist knowledge. It would need to be comprehensive. Green infrastructure is multifunctional, so a tool needs to cover all of the ecosystem services and not just one or two. And it needs to be something that instills confidence. Decision makers need to be confident that the results they're being given are credible and accurate, and that they can use them to argue their case when they're challenged by their colleagues. Now, alongside that piece of research, we also did some testing of the business model developed by our colleagues in the universities of Antwerp and Ghent. We tested that using several homegrown scenarios that taught us a great deal, and we took it out to 7 different Nature Smart Cities projects, the 7 pilot projects that we're running. And we also took it out to 8 different genuine municipal projects, many of which are in the audience today. And I want to say thank you for your engagement with this process, which was very important and extremely useful. Different projects, different scale, different complexity, from small neighborhood projects right up to large estate developments. And that let us pick up bugs, obviously. Let us test the adaptability of the model to real life. It allowed us to test and score against those key criteria of usability, comprehensiveness, and confidence. And it allowed us to use that feedback to develop the latest version of the business model, which we'll be looking at shortly, and which you will get a chance to experience for yourselves after the break. In the meantime, the Nature Smart Cities website has copies of the reports available for you for free download, and I commend them to you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And I think we have one question here. Can you see it on your screen there, Phil?
Yes, I can.
So how far are views about why green infrastructure is important influenced by a widespread limited understanding of the benefits of a connected multifunctional network? If we promote beauty, do we undersell green infrastructure? Okay,
so there are 2 questions there. My understanding from the research would be that the views about why GI is important is influenced by the limited understanding. The most common understanding of GI was about its multifunctionality. There was a lot less recognition of the idea of a connected multifunctional network. That kind of suggests that micro projects that might together add up to something substantial aren't necessarily recognized in the same way as a larger single project that delivers multiple benefits. If we promote beauty, do we undersell GI? I think that you wouldn't do GI to get beauty unless you had a different agenda to beauty. If by beauty you mean something that will attract visitors or something that will attract people to come and exercise, then no, you're not underselling GI by promoting beauty. But you wouldn't, I don't think, do GI just to make the place look nice. You would want something to be added to looking nice. Why are we making the place look nice? Is it because we want to stop people moving away? Is it because we want people to use this space to promote social cohesion? Is it because we want biodiversity? Is it because we want to improve people's mental health? So beauty as an end in itself, I wouldn't go there, but I would say that if you can add beauty into your GI, you make the case more compelling.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for that presentation and the comparison from what we did in the Mentimeter, which was surveying what you said, and then comparing that with the more in-depth research. In the question and answer chat at the bottom of the screen, somebody asked for a link to that report. We've just put it in there, which is fantastic. But now, better late than never. It really is my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Polly Billington, CEO of UK 100, former BBC journalist and then special advisor to the Department of Energy and Climate Change. Polly founded and co-founded UK 100 in 2016. And I'm sure she's going to tell us about that. So I won't take any more time and I'm going to give the floor over to Polly.
Thank you very much for inviting me to make this keynote address on the issue of nature smart cities. I think there's enormous opportunities that are arising at the moment in order to be able to make sure that nature is right at the heart of our climate action in the UK in particular. And I've got some observations about what needs to happen in order to be able to seize those opportunities and some of the barriers that might be getting in the way, particularly when it comes to financing those nature-based opportunities. There's some good news in the first instance. The UK government agrees with the Committee on Climate Change that local authorities are key to net zero transition. Government policy now gives them some power, but they'll need to push for more. And there is an opportunity for local authorities to do something really remarkable in their communities, revive the role of local authorities and get nature to be right at the heart of those climate ambitions. But that will require them to be creative and entrepreneurial and to make the most of the opportunities that are coming along. Nature is key to the action on climate, whatever kind of community you live in, because it reduces emissions and also, really importantly, it helps to build consent and support for other actions that need to happen in climate. And financing nature is still enormously challenging, but it can be done locally, especially if you combine it with other income generating activity. But the key is to make the case for more innovation on financing green infrastructure projects. And I hope we'll be able to talk a bit about that. Now, a little bit about us. I'm Polly Billington. I'm the Chief Executive of UK 100, which is a network of the most ambitious local authorities on climate and the environment across the UK. The good news, as I say, is that there is a growing consensus about how important local government is in our path to net zero. Firstly, people think local government should do this. Last year, we commissioned polling from Ipsos Mori, which showed that 40% of voters believe that their local council is best placed to tackle climate change in their area. Now, that is in contrast to national government only polling 31%. So if any local authorities are out there still thinking that they don't have the support of their voters, they need to be thinking again. Secondly, experts think local government should be doing this. In the UK, the Climate Change Committee, the National Audit Office, and many others all understand and articulate very clearly the huge potential of local authorities to be a driving force in the transition to net zero. And now, particularly importantly, the government acknowledges that local government should play an important role. It's there right in the net zero strategy that was published just before COP. But they will need to do more, that government, if they really want to unleash the power of local authorities to deliver green projects. Now, when it comes to finance, those things there's still a lot to play for. One thing that was announced in the net zero strategy was the establishment of net zero hubs. Now, some of you might already be familiar with your local energy hubs. There's 5 of them across England. It looks like, from what the strategy says, they're going to be repurposed into net zero hubs. Those organisations help and support local authorities to develop projects, energy projects at the moment, particularly to make them more investable by the private sector. Repurposing them so they're about net zero means that energy is part of it, but not all of it. So that's exactly where the possibility is of support for nature restoration and nature projects to come forward. But crucially, that is in the context of the establishment of the UK Infrastructure Bank. Now, that's intended to provide finance for local authorities as well as others in order to be able to prepare those projects to be investable by the private sector. We've been working really closely with the Treasury and with the team that are establishing that bank to understand how that bank will support local authorities in doing that. But local authorities taking the right approach will have huge scope to access capital finance, but they will need to have bold action on climate, which combines proven technologies as well as which can generate income alongside projects that may not obviously generate income, but bring benefit to the local community. So that's one of the things where nature restoration needs to be combined with regeneration of town centres, new housing development, transport projects, because those are much easier to calculate the economic benefit. The nature needs to be seen, then built in. So there's huge opportunities for this, but we need to be seeing nature solutions as having social and economic benefits. Now, we've published a report called The Economic Benefits of Local Climate Action, and I want to draw your attention to that particular piece of work, because there we see some of the ways that those clever economists can calculate the economic benefit of nature activity. For example, there are jobs available when you do nature-based activities. The government's Nature for Climate Fund is planning to plant 40 million trees. Now, the analysis suggests that that will create nearly 36,000 jobs in nature-based solutions across the country. That's definitely something that people will be interested in, particularly in some of those left behind areas where people are really looking for jobs to kickstart the economy after the pandemic. The government's £40 million investment has a potential to reap a return of £320 billion over the next half century, because the economic benefit per tree over 50 years can range up to £8,000. And there's very specific things, which those kind of numbers can sound very relevant to economists, but the crunchy stuff, which really makes a difference and very compelling to decision makers and indeed to the public, is what they see visibly in their communities. We know from this piece of research there is a genuine boost to high streets. Consumers are willing to pay more money for goods and services in shopping areas with large, well cared for trees. Now, that might sound a little bit silly, but of course, if you enjoy the shopping experience, you're more likely to dig deeper into your pocket. And there is also really good benefits in terms of falling crime. For every 10% increase in tree canopy cover, there is a 15% decrease in violent crime and a 14% decrease in property crime. Now, that might sound like a bit extraordinary, but even when controlling for other socioeconomic factors. So normally we think, well, there's lots of tree cover because it's a posh area, so there's likely to be less crime. Even controlling for that, increasing tree canopy decreases crime. And that's exactly the kind of thing that decision makers want to know about, because they will be making very, very tough decisions about how they spend money. So if you think about a conservative estimate of the economic benefit of trees, you start thinking about how you plant trees and where you plant them, you can start to see some real benefits across the country. We know that there are some of these big projects already being planned across the country from some of our members and beyond. So the Great Northern Forest Scheme plans to plant 50 million trees in a new woodland that will join up Liverpool, Manchester, Lancaster with Leeds, Sheffield and Hull. In around Glasgow, their city region, the Clyde Climate Forest is aiming to plant 18 million trees, 10 trees for every person in the region over the next decade. And that could create, we reckon, 2,250 new jobs in Glasgow. The West Midlands Combined Authority is planting a virtual forest because it will be very spread out, but 1 tree planted for every resident. That's 4 million trees being planted by 2035. So we can see how there is an opportunity that the local leaders are seizing to build in this kind of nature activity and nature restoration into the other ambitions that they've got, both on climate and on economic regeneration. But I want to also think about this not just in the context of numbers and money and so forth, but also the opportunities that are required in order to be able to make this happen more quickly and better. And there's some specific bits of legislation and guidance and so forth that's happening at national level that can really make a difference. We are expecting some kind of planning bill this year. We know that there was due to be one last year. It didn't quite happen. There's been a white paper. What comes forward is likely to be very different from what was previously discussed. But anyone on this call who's got any interest in influencing that planning bill must be asking their MPs and ministers to bind together the Town and Country Planning Act with the Climate Change Act. Any future planning bill really must include the Climate Change Act. Without it, the chances of us actually getting nature-based solutions and nature into any kind of planning project is much less likely to happen. We know that will make a real difference. Also, we now have the Environment Act. An enormous amount of political capital was expended on making sure that there is that nature-based target in the Environment Act. That's brilliant, but now we need to see how it will be implemented. So be asking questions of your decision makers about what they are doing to make sure that that nature-based target becomes a reality in everything that they do. And again, just reminding you about that UK Infrastructure Bank and how it's going to fund nature is still an open question at this moment. So again, when people are talking about the Infrastructure Bank, remind them that this isn't just about roads and about concrete. In fact, it's supposed to have a net zero mandate at its heart. And how is it going to fund the nature projects that you need? I just want to finish in a way with thinking about some examples of how those nature-based solutions actually happen in places. Because remember, the key element of all of this is that you need to be thinking about what happens in a place, and that nature, it isn't blanket, it changes from one place to the other. So we need to be able to make sure that it works. One of our members is Staffordshire Moorlands. They have 222 square miles of green spaces, but they're right next to a city, Stoke, where people will be wanting to have access to the countryside. Combining making the most of those beautiful green spaces with access for those people really makes a difference. So their green infrastructure delivery plan involves detailed habitat mapping, identifying opportunities for green infrastructure delivery, including wildlife corridors, and crucially, combining that with walking and cycling routes so that people can get out to that beautiful outdoors and genuinely enjoy it. So they're pulling together a list of 60 nature-based projects to begin with, and then work with partners such as the local wildlife trust and others to prioritize and develop a smaller number of those. They're already working on a community orchards project, which plants 30 orchards across the moorlands. And again, that's not just the council doing that on their own, they're combining it with parish councils and community groups, building up that consent and support that is so crucial if we want to make sure that when local authorities have to do more difficult things, that people understand that actually doing this makes a genuine difference and benefit to their communities. Now, enhancing green areas maintained by the council themselves just sounds like a no-brainer, but quite often this is the kind of thing that can be overlooked when budgets are tight. So putting that right into the heart of the overall strategy of the local authority is really important. And in Staffordshire Moorlands, that includes things like peatland restoration, a walks network, and again, that signage and wayfinding on the canals so that people can get into that nature. That nature recovery network will leave a lasting legacy, not only for the people who live in Staffordshire Moorlands, but people who live nearby. And that's one of the things I think that is important to remember, is that most people want to be able to be as close as possible to some kind of nature, and that can be sometimes more challenging for cities, but there are ways that you can build it up, and you can also make sure that there is that connectivity, which again, we need to make sure is decarbonised so that people can genuinely enjoy it. Our work on finance isn't just about the bank. It does point out that so much of the real challenges that face local authorities when developing projects in order to be able to access finance is as much to do with the rules as anything else. So although we'll talk about the bank, make sure that the planning rules, that your procurement rules, and that the design of the way that you go about this is aligned to be able to make sure that net zero is something that can really happen in your community. And the way that you'll do that is by making sure that there are some tangible benefits for people now. That is about economic and social benefits, because for far too long, we have focused on economic growth at the expense of the environment. Now we need to build in the environmental costs so that we can really make sure that we prioritize those with environmental benefits rather than environmental downsides. Once you start doing that, anything that depends on hydrocarbons and fossil fuels becomes extremely expensive, and things that restore nature become very, very worthwhile. So I'm really pleased again to be able to address you. I know that the rest of your conference will be extremely valuable in getting down into the roots and details of this. So I'll just leave you with a recommendation to have a look at that economic case for local climate action research that we commissioned, and also our power shift resource, which is particularly useful in understanding the powers that local authorities have got in order to be able to achieve local net zero action. It's not enough. The rules need to change. And yes, there will need to be a significant more investment, but with a way of calculating the economic benefits of nature-based solutions, we have a great opportunity to be able to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Polly. I can see that you're putting a lot of information there into the chat, which is wonderful for everybody. Thank you so much for that. And if anybody does have any questions, Polly can take them there on the chat, and she's can engage with you too. What we'd like to do now is go to the next presentation, which is your chance now to see if we do need that green infrastructure up front, if it's so critical given both the climate and the ecological emergencies that we're facing. How can we, given the barriers that we've just talked about, how can you create that compelling business case? Well, this is what the Nature Smart Cities capacity building workshop is all about. And Phil is now going to take us through an oversight of what the business model can offer you as officers in your local authorities. Phil, are you ready to share your screen?
Yes, I am. And you should now be able to see my screen. So as Pippa said, I'm going to take you through the business model. I'm going to show you what it does and a little, in a little sense, how it does it. But I'm really going to show you the screens that you can have a chance to work with after the break, and also some others that make up the package, which you won't actually be working with on the break. And to do that, I'm going to use an example. Now, to work through the business model with a real live project from scratch probably take between 2 and 3 hours. So I've deliberately accelerated the process in a Blue Peter kind of way by preparing an example earlier. And if I can get my screen to work, there we are. It's a genuine project. There is the possibility of creating a country park in South Cambridge. It's a site of around 32 hectares, which is currently pretty empty space, but it's in an area that's scheduled for significant housing development, as much of Cambridge is. So it's a relatively small site to be described as a country park, but it's thought to be an important potential amenity for this part of Cambridge. So I've got two scenarios. I've got the baseline scenario, which is the land as it stands at the moment, and the future country park scenario, which you might hope would represent an improvement, at least in some key areas. And the business model works along the basis of scenarios, different combinations of landscape elements that make up a project. And in this case, there's also a third scenario, because the red line to the right of this project, to the east of this project here, is actually a railway line. And there's a possibility that an additional railway station would be added into the mix here, and that would impinge on the land that's at the moment earmarked for the country park. So what we want the business model to be able to tell us is what the land contributes at the moment to key ecosystem services, what difference a country park will make and whether that represents good value, and what difference a station would make and how much damage that might do to the idea of the country park. So in Nature Smart Cities, we've developed a business model. It's been done by the universities of Antwerp and Ghent, and it's presented as a tool that will support decision making. It uses Excel programming, and it helps people who don't have the time or the expertise to explore the detail of ecosystem services. It enables comparison with both the existing landscape and between alternative new uses of that landscape, as we're going to see in this example. Because it uses Excel, it's using technology that's reasonably familiar, reasonably user-friendly, and software that virtually every authority actually has. And there's a guidance manual that goes along with the business model to support the user, so that they can refer to that and get cell-by-cell instructions on what they should be doing. Now, what you see on the screens in the business model is only the front end. There's a huge swathe of calculation going on behind the scenes, which is all based on extensive academic research in quite meticulous detail to inform the calculations that are going on. And it's also based on the research that I described earlier to support users. What the user sees is a series of worksheets that follow sequentially, one after the other, and which are described, which are completed in order. And here's the first one. This is where I've defined my baseline scenario, my first task here. And what I have to do here is to identify the different types of landscape that I've got on this site, this 32 hectares, and how much of it there is. I need to have done a little homework to do this. But this worksheet is fundamental to operating the business model properly. It's quite simple, though. You simply choose different categories of landscape, different types of landscape within those categories, and how much of it there is. And that's quite straightforward. And here I've added my two new scenarios. I'm getting a little bit more creative now. I can come back and amend these if I decide that I'm not getting what I want. I can increase the area I've allocated to one element and reduce another one, as long as I stay within my 32 hectare limit, and so on. And here you can see in my new scenario, I've made this a much more complex site with rather more landscape elements than exist at the moment. I've increased the size of the flower field dramatically from 10,000 hectares, 10,000 square meters to 156,000 square meters. So I'm going big on the flower field. I've included a playground, which wasn't there before. I've kept the tall grass and I've doubled the number of trees, but I've changed the grey infrastructure that was in the original scenario here to a permeable surface that I hope will be more amenable to water retention. I've added some shrubby plants, and I've also put in an allotment and some ponds. So I've made this, as I say, a much more complex environment. Now, with the reduced size country park, this is the one with the station, I've had to trim this back a bit. I've still got 32 hectares, but I've had to allow for quite a large area, 48,000 square meters of impermeable surface, which is going to be the ground that the station and its associated access and parking space is going to take up. And at the moment, I have no control over how they do that, so I have to assume that that's going to be impermeable. The next step is choosing my ecosystem services. Essentially, I have to ask, what is it I want to achieve here? What are my project's main goals? And I mean main goals. It could be any of these in relation to a country park, I think. Clearly, recreation is fundamental to any park project, but aesthetics is going to be important as well, because it needs to look nice. And I want it to help social cohesion. This is an area of new housing, and I want to use the country park to allow people to come together and to meet one another. I want it to provide health benefits in terms of providing space for exercise, addressing obesity, things like that. I also want it to do something about flooding in this area and to reduce the risk of flooding. And I'd like it to have some biodiversity because I think biodiversity is a good thing, and because I want the mental health benefits and the enjoyment that comes from biodiversity. Now, there might be, so those are my 6 ecosystem services that I'm definitely going to choose. I've got a list of 15 altogether, and I can make most of them apply to this project, but that's going to make me work rather harder than I want to and make my results more complex. So I need to choose the ones that really matter. Here are some other things that I could choose, but that might, in this case, be secondary. Carbon sequestration, reducing heat, air quality, education. I can get all of these out of my country park. But unless my local authority has a net zero policy that it's struggling to meet, carbon might not be as important as the other things I'm talking about. I might get funding from an educational source, in which case I'm going to have to make education an important goal. What I'm doing here is choosing the yardsticks I want my project to be measured against, the metrics that are going to be used. Each ecosystem service I choose will generate questions to help me explain what I'm trying to achieve, and also it will generate results that will demonstrate whether or not I'm achieving very much in those areas. So, for instance, on flood risk, I'll need to provide some information about rainfall. If I choose health, then the model will need to know how many people are likely to benefit from that opportunity. Now, if I happen to choose the wrong ecosystem services, I can always come back and add new ones. And already I can start getting some results from my work on this. Here's the baseline scenario results page for water retention. It tells me here what the water retention capability of my baseline landscape is. And it's calculating this using a retention coefficient for each different type of landscape that I've entered. So, for instance, my impermeable surface is rejecting more or less all the water that's thrown at it. It absorbs very little, but my lawns and my amenity grassland absorbs quite a bit, and my tall grass absorbs quite a lot. So I can actually use this information to think, well, have I got the right combination here? Well, let's see how that works out in my new scenarios. And here's my result for the country park. It's quite a lot bigger. The last one was 138,000 cubic meters, and now I've got 162,000 cubic meters. My baseline isn't useless, but my country park scenario is delivering much more in terms of that ecosystem service on flood risk. If I go for the reduced size country park with 48,000 square meters allocated to the railway station, I go back down to 138,000. So actually the station is having a significant impact on water retention and bringing it back down to the same level almost as the original baseline. And I can use these results to, as I say, to change the composition of my landscape. For instance, I could use this as an argument to Network Rail to put in a green roof if they want me to like what they're doing. The model generates two results for biodiversity. One is the Shannon-Weaver Index, which some people will be familiar with and others will find completely baffling. Essentially, it measures structural biodiversity. The higher the index, the greater the structural diversity of your landscape, meaning you have more variety of habitats and more biodiversity potential. And again, in this measurement, you can change the landscape and see the impact on the evidence. You can do this quite a lot in this business model. You can go back to that beginning sheet and change the composition and see what happens. And there's also an assessment of species potential, which is a rather more accessible piece of information. It assesses across 4 different species groups and down to detailed individual species, as we can see on this slide. Now, this is quite a complicated slide to take in, so I just want to highlight a few things here. I've had to add on the left-hand side more detail about my landscape to generate, to look at its suitability for different groups of species. Here I'm looking at birds, butterflies, bees, and amphibians. And within that, in the middle of this slide, I'm looking at detailed individual species within those groups. Now, there's one of these sets of results for each of my scenarios. So I can see which groups of species I'm most likely to attract, and within those species, which I'm most likely to see. So my country park tells me it's okay for birds. Red means it's an unsuitable landscape. Yellow is okay, green is good. My landscape here is poor for butterflies, it's mostly yellow, and poor for bees, but it's great for amphibians. So if I want to have a load of frogs in my country park, I'm on the right track. And if I look at species, I can see that it's good for blackbirds, they get a high score, not so good for chiffchaffs. So if I'm interested in chiffchaffs, I will need to do something to change things. And here's that chart shown again, but here I'm going to make 3 changes. I'm going to add bird feeders into my landscape. I'm going to add a compost heap, and I'm going to leave an area overgrown. And that's the difference that it makes. There's not much difference to bees or to amphibians, but I've made a huge difference to the potential for birds to enjoy this habitat, and I've made an enormous difference to the butterfly potential. So by making small changes in my landscape composition, I've had a big impact on my biodiversity potential. And the business model will allow me to play with these different elements to see what I can get out of my landscape. And I've no doubt that biodiversity officers will say, well, we already know some of this, but not all people working in green infrastructure are as familiar with what works for amphibians or what works for bees, and the business model can help with that. There are more results to come. For measurable ecosystem services like air quality, or the health benefits, I can get results that use a reliable, calculated metric. So in air quality, for instance, I'll get the kilograms of pollution that are removed from the atmosphere over the course of a year. On health benefits, I'll get a calculation of what are called dailies, the disability adjusted life years, which are a measure of the number of years of good health a person will enjoy. and I would expect quite a good benefit from a country park that's predicated on exercise. But there are lots of ecosystem services that are more difficult to measure. How do you measure social cohesion, for instance? How do you measure education in this context? And what we've done is developed a series of statements based on academic research that are closely linked to that ecosystem service. That might be true or might not be true, or might be true to some extent for each of our projects. We've attached weightings for each statement to indicate that statement's importance, probably to the local authority or to the funder. And we've attached scores for the extent to which each of the projects delivers against that statement. So for instance, here's a statement in the social cohesion group. Does this scenario provide opportunities for local people to meet and socialize? Now this gets a high weighting because it's one of the key objectives of the park scenario. And it gets a high score because the park scenario delivers those opportunities. It gets a slightly lower score for the station scenario because those opportunities have been reduced by the loss of space. And there are several of these statements. Depending on which ecosystem service you choose, you probably get 6 to 8 statements to analyze in that way. So you're building up a score based on an analysis of what your project sees as important and the extent to which that's delivered. And the overall outcome of that is a spider diagram. Here I'm comparing the results of my full-size park in green with my station reduced park in blue. Some ecosystem services stay the same. In fact, social cohesion stays the same in spite of the difference in that last statement. Biodiversity isn't particularly affected by the reduction, at least the potential for biodiversity isn't affected. Health isn't actually particularly affected, but aesthetics is. It doesn't look nearly as attractive with a station in the corner of it. Water retention is, as we saw before, and its recreation potential is because of the reduction of space. There's a very clear visual representation of the difference between my full-size park and my reduced-size park, which I can stick in front of my decision maker and which will be very quickly and easily understood. The decision model, the business model also deals in costs, and the cost spreadsheets are big, but here's a part of a cost calculation that shows the construction cost matrix. And all my landscapes from my 3 scenarios are coming through in the middle of this slide. I'm now going to allocate some costs to these things. Now, I don't need to allocate construction costs to the baseline scenario because it already exists. I don't need to build it. But for the full-size country park and the reduced-size country park, I will have costs involved in delivering these. And I can choose whether to use the typical costs for each landscape type, which are actually built into the business model, and which are based on extensive research into typical costs, or I can use my own costs. And obviously it's much better if I can use my own costs, but if I don't have accurate costings at this point, I can use the estimates in the business model to generate typical costs. And if I choose that typical cost route, I can choose whether to use the minimum cost, those that are in the lower bound here, the maximum cost, which is the upper bound here, or the average between the two, depending on what message I want to send. So for instance, if we look at permeable stone here, down here, I've got a minimum cost of 83 euros 54, a maximum cost of 150 euros. These are per square meter. So I can use one or other of those custom values or the midpoint between the two, or if I have a better idea of what the cost is going to be, I can use the custom value column to insert the actual the known cost, and that will override the pre-programmed costs completely. And I can do this for both construction costs and for maintenance costs. And on the other side of the financial coin, the business model will also generate this table showing the monetary benefits that might result from my changes. So here I'm looking at the baseline scenario, which does give me some results on water retention. And my new full-size country park scenario, which shows a much bigger benefit on water retention. And those benefits have a monetary value. Now, this money isn't going to come back into the authority as cash, but it might well come back to the authority as a cost saving in terms of dealing with the outcomes of flooding. Similarly, with health, there's a big cash benefit, a non-cash benefit from improving people's health, but it won't come back to the authority. It might be seen in the reduced impact on public services of a healthier population. So this is trying to give a bigger picture of the benefits of a green approach as opposed to a grey one. And the final output from the business model is a fact sheet. And this is intended as a summary I can give to my decision maker so that she can make an informed decision. In this example, she's already decided to go ahead with the country park, but wants to know how much will be lost by allowing the station to feature in it. And one of the early things the fact sheet gives her is an identification of the different ecosystem services I've used to produce this document. Now, she might think, well, you haven't looked properly at this. We need to deal with carbon as well. So go back and put carbon in. And I can do that. Here's that spider diagram that we generated earlier. That comes up in the fact sheet. It's quite a powerful visual representation of the difference between the green line, the full-size park, and the blue line, the reduced-size park. Here are some numeric results that are generated. I'm getting a good benefit on water. I'm getting a good benefit on air. And I can also demonstrate benefits in relation to biodiversity. And here's what you'll see in relation to the statements. I can select which statements appear. So I can show that in my blue scenario, I'm getting some benefit, but in my green scenario, I'm getting greater benefit other than in the sense of place and visual identity. So she gets a chance to look at all of those. And there are also a few financial charts. This is the one for maintenance. The station project will actually reduce the annual maintenance charge by about £6,500 a year. So she has to decide, is that saving in maintenance worth what it costs in lost benefits? And that's what I'm going to ask her to decide. But she actually has data on which she can base that decision. And if I want to, I can help her with her decision by making drawing some conclusions, by saying that the station proposal is going to reduce the space, how it adversely impacts on some key deliverables, the cost savings, and my recommendation. And the idea here is to produce a single document with all the important information on it that allows the decision maker to ask questions, to see the bigger picture, and to reinforce her arguments with colleagues so that she can justify her decision. And that's the business model. It's taken a lot of work to get there, but it is now, I think, a very effective document, a very effective tool, and you'll get the chance to play with it shortly.
Thank you, Phil. If you stop sharing your screen. Thank you very much. So we do have two questions. And what I'm going to do, Phil, is put one question to Vito. I'm going to bring him up so he can also help us in the design. But the two questions are, how were the species in the species tab selected? Seems a random mix. Did I miss the selection? And the second question, Good connectivity has been argued as key to green infrastructure, both conceptually in terms of the details of service delivery. How are variations in connectivity of the scenario landscapes included within the business model? Or is it that connectivity is actually not as important to what green infrastructure delivers as we thought?
Okay, well, the species were determined by colleagues at the University of Ghent, and I don't know what criteria they used to select them, but my understanding would be that these would be fairly typical species. They've not been selected on the basis of being endangered, for instance, or at risk, but I can't answer that question in more detail. As to connectivity, I think that's a difficult.
Phil, can you put your video on so we can see you as you're speaking?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
As to connectivity, I think that's a difficult one to measure in the business model. I think that the business model probably doesn't recognize connectivity as easily as it does the ecosystem service outputs of a project. We've been working with one of our partner cities that's developing a network of micro projects, and we found that it was actually quite difficult to apply the business model to that kind of citywide context. What we actually had to do was to take a more localized approach and look at the micro projects that were within that immediate locality, a network in this case of about 8 or 10 streets. So it's not that connectivity isn't important, but I have to accept that the business model doesn't address that as conclusively as it does multifunctionality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have one more question. Has any thought, this is from Amanda Parrott, has any thought been given to the market proposals around biodiversity net gain in relation to the model?
Yeah, at the time of developing, it wasn't clear what the metrics for that would be. And we also have to bear in mind that although biodiversity net gain is coming into the UK's matrix for assessing biodiversity, in Europe, it's different. In Europe, it'll be no net loss of biodiversity. So the criteria are different. What the business model does is highlights the potential of a landscape for biodiversity. It doesn't measure the volume of biodiversity that you will get. So the fact that an area might be suitable for chiffchaffs doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get chiffchaffs, and the business model won't tell you how many chiffchaffs you'll get. You would have to use some more specialized knowledge to assess that. But we also have to bear in mind that this business model has to apply across different regimes in respect of biodiversity measurement.
Thanks very much, Phil. And there's another question from somebody who hasn't given their name, but they're saying, is the business model based on initial habitat surveys that take place, which provide a snapshot of the landscape, its habitat features, flora and fauna on site, and their ecological importance?
I don't know the answer to that. That would have to be a question to the academic partners that worked on those parts of the business model.
But I'm assuming that when people do use it, they would input whatever they've got from their own ecological service, wouldn't they?
Well, they would input the landscape content, and that's the content that they would put into the business model, and from that the business model generates a biodiversity potential. So it recognizes different landscape components and the contribution that each of those can potentially make to biodiversity. But what lies behind that in terms of how the assessment's done, that's the realm of academic specialists, and I have not penetrated that myself.
Good. And Anna, so we have the last question, which is, the model looks fantastic. When will it be available for local authorities to use?
Well, thank you. It's good to hear that people like what they've seen. So we are planning to make the business model available in time for participants to use at our second capacity building workshop. So it'll be made available to participants then. If you can't attend that workshop for any reason, it will also be made available via the Nature Smart Cities website. And if you are interested, which I hope you are, please follow our Nature Smart Cities LinkedIn channel and also sign up to our newsletter. We also have your mailing details now, so we will provide you updates and let you know when it's available. We are also looking for local authorities who might be interested in applying the business model to a green infrastructure project they have been planned to participate as a case study in our next workshop. So if you are interested in having a bit of an advanced go with the business model and helping us by becoming a case study that we can detail at our next workshop, we'd be really happy to hear from you and work with you on that.
And what we'd like to do now is to invite you to join us for the second session of the morning after our first session. So now we're going to get into the passenger seat really and test drive the business model. We're going to have a virtual coffee break, but stay tuned whilst you sip your coffee and watch some inspiring videos from the pilot study projects by local authorities in The Hague and Antwerp. We'll also be using the introductory video as well again. And then at 11 o'clock, join us for a chance to see the business model in action, where in your groups, you will have the challenge to green up a project design and make that compelling business case to decision makers. So you will have received early this morning an email with your second Zoom joining link, which is going to be Zoom meeting with breakout groups. And in that email, you'll see that you also received 2 documents, which are the group work scenarios. And you're going to be put into groups to deal with either of those scenarios. And this gives you all of the information for that exercise so that you can be working with it alongside and being an active participant into that.
Thank you everybody for your active participation in this morning's session. The first workshop was really designed with the aim to introduce the business model tool and provide participants with an opportunity to look under the bonnet to see how it works and can be used. We hope you found the session useful and that it's whetted your appetite to see more of the business model. We hope you can all join us for our second workshop on the 8th of June at Mansion House in London, which will include a site visit to a local green infrastructure project. The workshop will take us further, demonstrating how to put the business model into practice. During the day, we will share examples of where local authorities have used it to improve green infrastructure, but also apply the business model to real-life case studies. If you like what you've seen today and also want to be considered as a case study for the next workshop, then please get in touch using the details that will be on the screen shortly. At the second workshop, all participants will be provided with their own copy of the business model and the practitioner's handbook so they can start applying the tool to their future GI projects. Lastly, there will also be the opportunity to network with local authority officers from over 35 local authorities, all with a role in urban greening. We really hope you can make it. If you want to find out more about the Nature Smart Cities project, the next workshop, join our active LinkedIn network, or get in touch, then the contact details can be found on the screen. All that is left for me to do is once again to thank you for your time. We hope to see you for the second workshop on the 8th of June.